Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a fascinating realm that often shapes our world in subtle yet profound ways. Institutional theory and institutional
It's a
change.
big one. Definitely affects more than we realize.
You've shared a compelling article from the Academy of Management Journal by Dacin, Goodstein, and Scott. It's an intro to a special research forum, right? And it promises to unpack how these deeply embedded rules of the game in society, our institutions, how they actually shift and evolve.
That's the core idea.
Our mission today is to give you a shortcut, really, to understanding these powerful forces. We want to reveal insights into, well, why things change the way they do and maybe who's driving those changes.
Exactly. We're going beyond that common idea of institutions as just these, stable structures.
Right, the things that don't change.
Yeah. But we want to explore what causes them to weaken or disappear or transform and how entirely new ones pop up. Think of it as peeling back the layers to see the dynamic forces that truly shape our world.
Okay, so let's start by grounding ourselves. Historically, when we talked about institutional theory, it often felt like it was about explaining stability, why things stay the same, right?
Yeah.
Why there's this persistence, this homogeneity in organizations and practices.
That was the traditional focus, yeah.
But this article suggests a crucial evolution in that thinking. What's the core shift the authors are highlighting here?
It's a pretty profound shift, actually. The main takeaway is that institutions themselves are, well, far from static. They're dynamic. They change over time. They're often contested. Their effects aren't uniform or always taken for granted.
So not everyone just accepts them blindly.
Not at all. And this article specifically moves the conversation towards understanding how institutions are created, transformed, and even extinguished. It's about recognizing that, yeah, they drive stability, but they're also incredibly susceptible to change themselves. The real insight, the rules of the game aren't set in stone. They're constantly being rewritten.
Okay, that immediately makes it feel so much more relevant, more dynamic. So if these deeply embedded rules can actually change, what causes them to start, well, to unravel? What are the pressures that kick off this whole process?
Right, that's where this concept of deinstitutionalization comes in. It's basically the processes by which established norms, established practices weaken and maybe eventually disappear.
Huh, deinstitutionalization.
Yeah. And the article points to three main types of pressures. Oliver first identified these back in '92 that act as triggers. You can think of it like institutions just sort of losing their power to compel, how these once unquestioned rules or practices start to fray and eventually fade away. Kind of like an old habit you just stop doing, maybe without even realizing it at first.
That's a great analogy. Okay, so what's the first kind of pressure we should look for, the first trigger?
The first are functional pressures. These pop up from perceived problems in performance or utility. Essentially, if an institution or maybe a practice within it just isn't working as well as it used to, or maybe its usefulness declines because the whole environment around it has shifted, that creates a really powerful incentive for change. The key insight is, when an institution starts to falter, often the first signal is a crack in its usefulness.
So if it's just not efficient anymore, it can't keep up with new demands, it becomes vulnerable. Can you give us an example of that?
Absolutely. The article mentions a study of higher education publishing. Back in the mid-'70s, you had this intensified resource competition, market acquisitions, and it really undermined the traditional professional norms.
Oh.
The old ways of operating just weren't functionally serving their needs anymore, and that led to this new, much more aggressive market logic taking over.
Right.
Or think about liberal arts colleges. They were facing shifting student preferences, more competition. So many started adopting these professionally oriented programs, like business or communications. The traditional model, even though it was deeply institutionalized, just wasn't functionally viable enough on its own to attract students in the same way.
That makes perfect sense. If the machine isn't producing the results people want, they start looking for a new machine. Okay, what's the second type of pressure?
Next up, we have political pressures. Now, these stem from shifts in interests, shifts in power distributions that, previously supported the existing arrangements. What's fascinating here is that it's really about who holds the power and what they want.
Ah, okay.
If that balance of influence changes, new groups can push for agendas that seriously challenge the status quo.
So it's not just about whether a system is working, but maybe more about who benefits or who has a voice in that system. Is that the idea?
Exactly. Take the Canadian accounting profession example. The professional associations saw these market forces demanding new services, and instead of just clinging to the traditional roles, they responded? Well, they altered the political context for firms. They started extending services beyond just traditional accounting. You include things like management advisory services. And they legitimated this, interestingly, by referencing values like service to clients, sort of subtly reframing their professional purpose to align with these new power dynamics and market demands.
Clever. And there's that powerful example from Canadian museums too, right? The push to bring in private sector business planning and performance
Oh,
measures.
that's a fantastic case study
Yeah.
because it led to this really stark clash between cultural values and economic value systems.
Yeah.
The political pressure came from advocates pushing for a more market-driven approach,
Right.
but it met strong resistance from those who were upholding the museum's core cultural mandate.
Yeah.
It just showed how contested institutional change can be when it's political like that. You got different groups, different power bases,
Yeah.
essentially trying to redefine the fundamental purpose of the organization.
Okay, so we've got functional, we've got political. What's the third type of pressure that can spark this unraveling, this deinstitutionalization?
The third category is social pressures. These come from factors like, say, group differentiation, the emergence of really diverse beliefs, or maybe changes in laws and just broader social expectations. It's the evolving fabric of society itself that can exert pressure.
Ah, okay.
Take new demographics entering the workforce, new values becoming mainstream, new legal frameworks being put in place.
So things like maybe a more diverse workforce demanding different things, or shifting public opinion on social justice, or even new legal requirements like environmental regulations. Could those be the spark?
Absolutely. The article highlights a rape crisis center in Israel. Its prevailing feminist ideology, which was, deeply institutionalized there, was significantly altered.
Yeah.
Why? Because new participants bringing different therapeutic focuses joined the organization. Their new ways of seeing things, their interpretive frameworks, just diminished the consensus on the old, taken-for-granted practices. And that led to a pretty fundamental change in the institution's whole approach. It really shows how new members and their beliefs can profoundly shift an institution's core identity.
This brings us to a really critical point, I think. The role of individuals and groups in actually making change happen. It feels like early institutional theory sometimes downplayed this, focusing more on these big impersonal forces.
That's a fair critique, yeah.
But this forum really brings human agency, people making choices right to the forefront. It's not just abstract forces, it's people.
It is. Actors are not passive recipients of institutional forces. They interpret things, they perceive meaning, they make choices. And this leads us straight to the concept of institutional entrepreneurship.
Institutional entrepreneurship.
Yeah, these are the agents, the people or groups who actively deploy resources, not just to adapt to the environment, but to actually build a new environment.
Okay. Institutional entrepreneurship, that sounds really powerful. It implies this almost proactive, innovative role in changing the rules, a deliberate act of creation, not just reaction.
Precisely. It's about those who don't just react to change, but actively create it. Think of Site Microsystems as the main sponsor of Java technology back in the day.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
They acted as a classic institutional entrepreneur. They were trying to destroy existing standards and build entirely new rules for the whole software industry,
Huh?
even amidst a lot of conflict with established players, right?
Right.
The real takeaway here is that this isn't just about creating a new product. It's about rewriting the very rules of the game for an entire industry or even society. They're kind of like the architects of new realities.
But okay, for any new idea or practice, no matter how brilliant or well-backed it is to really stick, to become an institution, it needs something else, something fundamental for it to be accepted. What is that?
That something is legitimacy. The creation, the transformation of institutions requires others. Well, it requires them to see these new alternatives as appropriate or desirable, or maybe just the most viable option available.
Uh-huh.
It needs to be accepted as the new proper way of doing things. It's really the difference between just an idea floating around and a universally accepted practice.
So it's not enough to just have a good idea. It needs to be seen as right or desirable or maybe just necessary by the wider group. Like, wasn't there that example with Edison introducing electric lighting?
Yeah.
He had to embed it in familiar designs, make it look like the existing gas lamps to make it more acceptable, less threatening. He was basically providing a bridge to legitimacy.
That's a perfect illustration. Legitimacy can come from conforming to prevailing interpretations, like Edison did, or it could come from positive market feedback, people buying it, or even from developing new constitutive rules that provide clear guidelines for the change. Sometimes, even subtle things like identity shifts, how an organization names itself, for instance, can be critical for securing legitimacy, aligning with what people expect now. The bottom line is, without legitimacy, an idea just remains an idea. It can't become an institution.
We've talked about the why, the pressures, and the who, the agents, the entrepreneurs, but it's also crucial to understand the how. The article really emphasizes that institutional change isn't just some automatic reaction to pressure. It's a dynamic process, often complex. What does that process often look like?
Well, the process often involves this really critical stage of theorization and legitimation.
Theorization, what does that mean exactly?
Theorization is basically about identifying the failings of the existing norms and, crucially, justifying the new ones, often on moral grounds or pragmatic grounds. It's about crafting the narrative, the story, for why change is needed and articulating a compelling vision for the new way.
Okay, building the case.
Exactly. And as this new narrative diffuses, as it spreads and gains acceptance, the new norms start to acquire legitimacy, and then they become institutionalized.
So it's not enough just to introduce a change. You have to explain why it's the right change. You have to convince people that the new way is superior or more appropriate somehow.
Precisely.
We saw this in that Canadian accounting example you mentioned. Expanding services was justified as providing a high level of service, which aligned with existing professional values. That was their theorization, their story.
Exactly right. It wasn't just doing it. It was explaining why it was right within their existing value system. But conversely, think about the Canadian museums again.
Right.
The attempt to introduce business planning was resisted because some felt it would fundamentally threaten the cultural value. So here, the theorization of the new practice clashed directly with existing, deeply held values. And the result was a much more contested, much more difficult process. The article calls it a dialectical interplay between actions, meanings, and actors. It's messy sometimes.
This deep dive really shows us that institutional change happens at all sorts of scales, from tiny interactions right up to global movements. It feels like it's happening constantly, everywhere.
Indeed it is. We see these micro-level changes, like those subtle shifts in the Israeli rape crisis center's routines, just because new participants brought different approaches. Or think about the impact of new public management ideas being introduced into, say, a division of Canadian provincial government. It subtly alters day-to-day operations, employee expectations.
Yeah.
These might seem small, but they genuinely redefine everyday reality for people working there.
And then you've got the other end of the spectrum, these huge macro level changes, like the restructuration of entire professional service fields, publishing, accounting, finance across multiple countries. That's where the fundamental rules of a whole industry are being rewritten. That's a massive scale of change.
And these large-scale transformations are often influenced by major shifts in regulatory policies or the development of new economic theories, maybe even the rise of new political ideologies. But what's particularly fascinating, I think, is that while ideas and models often travel globally, they aren't simply replicated everywhere.
Ah, interesting.
They often get translated. And they end up producing divergent outcomes, not uniform ones.
So it's not about everything becoming exactly the same globally, but more about new, unique forms emerging from the mix of old and new elements, like a global idea gets customized locally.
Precisely. The article calls this process bricolage.
Bricolage, like DIY.
Kind of. It's not about designing something totally new from scratch. It's more like creative tinkering. You take existing elements, maybe from different systems or cultures, and you combine them in a novel way to form something new and adapted. A hybrid that fits the local context is why, an international business model might look quite different in Tokyo than it does in New York.
That makes sense. The article also pushes us to look beyond just changes within a single type of organization. It suggests we need to see how entire fields are transformed. That gives us a much broader perspective on these shifts. What does that broader lens reveal?
Yeah, taking that wider view reveals several key shifts. First, you see changes in the relationships among organizations, like maybe contractual ties replacing equity ties, which signifies a fundamental shift in how organizations partner up and structure things.
Okay.
Second, you see shifts in organizational boundaries themselves, like hospitals unbundling services, spinning off certain functions into separate units, or conversely, integrating into much larger healthcare systems. Both redefine what a hospital is in a fundamental way.
And it's not just about existing organizations adjusting their shape, is it? The article mentions we also see the emergence of entirely new populations of organizations.
Absolutely. Think about the explosion of tech startups in Silicon Valley decades ago,
Mm.
or the growth of nonprofits tackling completely new social issues. These are often fueled by that institutional entrepreneurship we talked about, or even social movements fighting for new interests. They create whole new categories of entities that simply didn't exist before.
And what about the very boundaries of these fields themselves? Can those shift too?
Oh, definitely. We need to look at shifts in the field boundaries themselves. Think about deregulation in financial services that completely recarved the landscape of what's allowed and who can operate where.
Big changes.
Huge. Or new conceptual views of the environment shaping how entire industries have to operate now. Or technological disruptions that just redefine what's possible and who the key players are. And finally, changes in governance structures are absolutely key, moving beyond just government regulation to include these quasi-public and private forms of governance.
Right, like industry associations setting standards.
Exactly. These systems don't just regulate, they also constitute and legitimize organizational forms. They affect everything from property rights to who counts as a stakeholder.
And it sounds like it's a two-way street. Organizations aren't just passively affected by these structures, they actively try to influence them, right? Through lobbying, interpretation, negotiation.
Precisely. It's a constant dynamic interplay of power and meaning, a dance between the institutional forces and the actors within them.
Okay, as we start to wrap up this deep dive, there's one more area the author suggests for future exploration, and it feels profound. It's the moral dimension of institutional change. This takes it from abstract theory right down to the core of our human experience, to what it means to be an individual caught up in these changing systems. That's a powerful thought to end on.
It truly is. Because institutions aren't just about rules on paper, they shape our individual identity, our roles. The article quotes Bella and colleagues saying institutions guide and sustain individual identity by making possible or impossible certain ways of behaving, and importantly, shaping character by assigning responsibility.
Wow.
So when institutions change, it can fundamentally alter who we feel we are, what we're supposed to do. And that's often where these deep moral questions surface.
So big societal shifts, like, say, corporate consolidation leading to layoffs, or funding limits changing how healthcare is delivered. These aren't just organizational shifts on a chart. They can become genuine moral crises for the individuals working within them. It challenges their sense of purpose, their loyalties, maybe their ethics.
Exactly. The concept of demoralization emerges. It's the erosion of a particular moral calling. They use physicians as an example. Due to these changing institutional environments, budget pressures, new metrics, it affects their loyalties, their commitments, their perceived ethical obligations, perhaps, to patients. It can create this profound inner conflict. This isn't just about job descriptions changing. It could feel like a change in the very character of a profession or a person's life work.
And this doesn't just apply to individuals, right?
Yep.
But maybe to organizations themselves, their character or integrity can be put at issue when the institutional ground shifts beneath them.
That's right. Organizations, over time, develop commitments to certain values and principles, often captured in their mission. Institutional change can create this deep tension between maintaining that integrity, that sense of purpose, and being responsive to new environmental demands, maybe market pressures. It's a really delicate balance.
Yeah.
The article mentions chemical and petroleum companies, for instance, which initially resisted environmental concerns. They only really refined their mission and values, publicly at least, under growing pressure. That highlights that tension between, maintaining a core identity and adapting to external moral expectations.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really shown us that institutions are anything but static. They're like these living, breathing entities constantly being shaped and reshaped by functional pressures, political struggles, social shifts, and importantly, the agency of individuals and groups pushing for change.
We've definitely seen how they transform. From those micro-level shifts in meaning, like in a small organization, right up to macro-level restructuration of entire industries and global trends. And we've glimpsed the really profound implications for individual identity, organizational integrity, and maybe even our collective moral compass. It's a testament, really, to the dynamic nature of human organization.
It really makes you think differently about the hidden forces behind pretty much every major shift around us, whether it's a new business model taking off, a change in how we get healthcare, or even just how a local community group operates differently now. So what does this all mean for you listening? Well, the next time you see a new trend emerge, or maybe an old practice fade away, consider this. How much of what we experience today is actually a carefully constructed hybrid, a mix of past and present institutions, maybe a clever act of that bricolage?
Hmm.
And maybe more importantly, what are the quiet, often profound moral dilemmas being navigated by the people at the heart of these changes? Those whose very sense of self and purpose might be challenged by these shifts.
Keep those questions in mind. Because understanding institutional change isn't just abstract theory. It's really about understanding the constant evolution of the world we live in,
Mm.
and ultimately, our own place within it.
Until next time, keep diving deep.